I think most Americans are familiar with the ways in which genocide theory has justified or incited mass shootings in the United States. People are less aware of how this very idea can be used not just by a person with a rifle, but a person with an army. That Palestinians are inherently human animals who are coming and trying to eradicate us. And so we have to protect ourselves. That's genocide theory.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud. All about humanity, so this right here for everyone. Uplift, amplify, empower everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time zone you're living in, it's time for Sumud.
Visit sumudpod.com to subscribe and connect with us on social media. You can also support our work by contributing monthly on the Support Us page. Even $10 a month helps us continue amplifying Palestinian voices and those in solidarity. Thank you.
On this episode of the Sumud Podcast, we uplift, empower, and amplify Dr. Ibram X. Kendi and his book, Chain of Ideas, The Origins of Our Authoritarian Age. Welcome, Dr. Kendi.
Of course, thank you for having me.
You mind if I read a little bit about you? Give you some flowers here. You are one of the world's leading historians of racism and an influential anti-racist scholar. You are the Carter G. Woodson Endowed Chair at Howard University and the inaugural director of Howard's Institute for Advanced Study. You are a National Book Award-winning author of 17 books. 5 of them are New York Times #1 bestsellers. Your work includes Stamped from the Beginning, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and now Chain of Ideas. Your work has earned you a place on Time Magazine's list of 100 most influential people and the MacArthur Genius Grant. Welcome, Dr. Kendi.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
This episode is proudly sponsored by Palestinian-American attorney Ibrahim Awad. You may know him as the Karate Attorney. He's a huge member of our community and a big supporter of the podcast. Follow him at Karate Attorney on all social media outlets or visit his website, karateattorney.com. So just for the audience to remember, you were on this podcast before. Thank you for coming on again. Yes. They should definitely check that one out. And I also want to just mention 17 books. You've written more books than your detractors have probably read. How does that feel?
It certainly feels good because I typically like to remind us that, even as they're hating on us, we're creating.
Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely right. I hear that. All right. So you mentioned in the book, by the way, brilliant book. I'm a huge fan. I'm a fan of many of your books, as you could tell right here. But you say in your book, I did not find the subject of this book. The subject of this book found me. That subject is this chain of ideas that turns great replacement theory into the dominant logic of our age. What does that mean that it found you?
I think first, it helps for people to understand what is great replacement theory. And so what I mean by great replacement theory is this is a political theory that suggests that these powerful elites are facilitating peoples of color to displace the lives and even the livelihoods of white people who now apparently need authoritarian protection. And so when you hear terms or ideas like immigrants of color are invading the nation, when you hear ideas like diversity is discrimination, when you hear notions that render a particular ethnic or racial group as a terrorist inherently, when you are being told that the nation is being lost, you're hearing great replacement theory. And what's striking to me when I started studying this topic is I did not know the sweep and the power and the spread of great replacement theory, but I also did not know that great replacement theorists, even like Renaud Camus, who coined the term the Great Replacement in 2010, positioned as the primary antagonist of great replacement theory, anti-racism. And so that's back in like 2010, before I had written any books on anti-racism. he would then go on to write another book in which he doubles down that anti-racism is more or less facilitating the Great Replacement. And so it then allowed me to understand what was powering this major backlash to my work and the work of many others in the aftermath of 2020. Because at the time, we knew the backlash was coming, but the force of it, the global force of it, I think to a certain extent caught some of us by surprise. And now I began to understand that this had been building for years.
To be fair, the majority of the force was against you. Comment? Keeping it real.
I can't speak to that, but I think what I can speak to is that, you know, many of these folks certainly tried to undermine me and my work and tried to not allow people to recognize that my work was based on a scholarly foundation, tried to render me this boogie person, but now I understand why.
Yeah, yeah. You write about being misrepresented, maligned, and villainized by Great Replacement politicians and theorists. You say that the bad faith attacks and character assassinations kept coming, so you did what scholars do. You went to the lab. You researched, studied, and really understood the attacks and why the attacks were coming towards you. And that's when you realized that it had very little to do with you personally. The links in the chain preceded you. What was that aha moment for you when you were doing the research that this is not personal, that this is part of a larger system?
Well, I mean, first, I think when I sought to really understand at the time how and why so many people in the United States in particular were empowering electoral officials that were claiming that they were protecting them when they were actually using their power to harm them. When I set out to understand like what was the origins of that, I arrived at Great Replacement theory. Mm-hmm. And then as I started to understand Great Replacement or study or research Great Replacement theory, that's what took me around the world. That's what took me to France, where I mentioned Renaud Camus coined the term the Great Replacement. And frankly, it took me across Europe, took me to Asia, to the Middle East, to Latin America. And it also took me throughout history because going all the way back to the late 19th century, you had colonial officials pushing a form of Great Replacement theory to state that if colonialism falls, in the global South, that people of color will come to Europe and take over, yeah. Right? I mention all of that because ultimately the aha moment was when I realized that this was a global idea. It was a transnational idea. It was literally operating in many countries around the world. And so it certainly did not specifically have to do with Americans, let alone me. And it also, I think the aha moment was when I really understood its long history, throughout particularly the West.
Yeah. Did it make you feel better in any way that it wasn't personal? Does that make sense? It wasn't a personal attack. I think they just viewed you as now a threat to the larger system, maybe?
The times in which I am most struggling emotionally, actually, is when I don't have intellectual clarity. So I don't fully understand what's happening in society, in the world, in our politics, certainly what's happening to me. So the more I researched and wrote Chain of Ideas, the more it gave me a sense of clarity of what had, I argue, become the most dominant political theory of our time. So now I began to understand the logic of the Trump administration. I began to understand why they were so deeply aligned with elected officials around the world. I began to understand a playbook that this administration that was following that had been written or revised by other elected politicians like Orban in Hungary or Modi in India or Bukele in El Salvador.
How much did you know about these countries and these individuals from history before you started your research? Because I think, was it 100 countries
Yeah.
something that you studied?
I mean, as an historian, particularly an historian of racism is not a purely U.S. phenomenon, and you can't really understand the history of racism without understanding its global dimensions. Blackness, for instance, as a concept, is a global idea. And I had understood and certainly studied racism from a global standpoint. So I knew many of these figures and even some of the ideas and some of the parties, but I knew them in a disconnected fashion. And so I didn't really begin to connect the dots conceptually, until I wrote Chain of Ideas.
Yeah, no, brilliant. And you were very vulnerable in this book. You state, or you shared, that you felt a tug of this great replacement theory, that you gained the ability to empathize with the people who have led to see you, a Black man, as the replacement. And you even recalled feeling your livelihood was being threatened by demographic change and feeling angry at times. Why was it important to call that out and admit it?
Well, I think first and foremost, I have tried to write for years about the criticality of us being honest and vulnerable, frankly, about our own ideas and how even someone like me needs to block or unlearn particularly new racist ideas or newly resurgent ideas. And so I just think that as a scholar in particular, it's important for us to be honest about where we were conceptually when we entered into the research project. I think you have some scholars who present themselves as quote unquote objective. I was trained that there is no such thing as objectivity, but there is a such thing as a scholar being honest. And so first and foremost, I thought it was important to be honest, but I also thought it was important to give a personal example of what in the Chain of Ideas, I talk about as the mutation of great replacement theory. That even as this started, or I should say started reemerging as purely a racist idea, this idea that Black people were coming or brown people were coming to displace or replace or take over quote unquote white countries, it's mutated. So the idea that there's a war against white people has mutated to say that there's a war against men. And I'm a man. Yeah. And I've heard those ideas. It's mutated to say that there's a war against citizens, that quote unquote immigrants are taking over and stealing elections. I'm a citizen, of the United States. It's mutated to say that quote unquote traditional values are under attack. And when they say traditional, meaning heterosexism, by queer people. Well, I'm a heterosexual. So I could see how those other mutations of great replacement theory has impacted me. And so I wanted to be honest about that. And I thought, again, as a scholar, it's important for us to be honest.
Do you realize how powerful it is to A, recognize that, and B, say it out loud? I know humility is important, but
Well, I do know within our discourse around racist ideas and even bigotry more broadly, most people, even people on the left, are very loath to acknowledge, right, the ways in which they have thought or even expressed racist or Islamophobic or sexist or homophobic ideas. And I think that's important because I don't know of any other way in which we can, as individuals, first and foremost, unlearn those ideas if we're just denying them. But more importantly, I don't see how we can have empathy for the people who are awash and inundated with those ideas and don't know it.
You then later state that, but then I saw politicians manufacturing and manipulating my anger. I did not want my privilege to be my prison. I wanted to imprison my privilege to free my power. Again, powerful statement. What was that inflection point for you to realize that?
I think when it ultimately, when I through the research for Chain of Ideas, when I landed on and gained a full understanding of what I call the last link in the chain of ideas. And this is an idea that compels people to fight for privileges provided by dictators instead of power provided by democracy. And so you have, what I argue and what I try to show is great replacement theory leads people to that. And I would also argue that typically people conjoin privilege and power. In other words, people believe that if they have privilege, they have power. And that may have been the case for the better part of this nation's history, but certainly now you have a situation in which, oligarchs have hoarded a tremendous amount of power. And they have said to traditionally privileged groups that we will maintain your privileges, but only if you give up your freedom, your rights, and your power. And I think many people are succumbing to that. And so that's how democracy is being eroded, in this country and in other countries. So you have men like me or heterosexuals or citizens who are like, all I want is my crumbs of privilege. Like, I'm going to fight for that. I'm going to maintain that. I don't want to lose that. But then all the while, my power is being taken away. But I have my crumbs. I have my privilege. I have a little bit more than other people.
So what does this say for somebody that's a scholar like you, that's so educated, that you sort of fell into that trap as well by the powers that be?
I think what it says is it speaks to the sophistication of these ideas. And I think that, and frankly, even the book title, Chain of Ideas, it comes from a French thinker in the late 1700s who essentially stated that the French monarchy, you could continue to control people with iron or literal physical chains, but there's a much more effective way to dominate people. And that is chaining them by their own ideas. And so I think that it really speaks to the age that we're in. I think in which people would recognize attempts to enslave them with chains, but they don't necessarily recognize the way in which a great replacement theory and them believing that their status or their lives are being lost is facilitating their domination.
That's Servan. Is it Servan or
Servan? Yes.
Okay. You mentioned that's where the title of the book comes. He also says a full despot can constrain slaves with iron chains, but a true politician binds them much more strongly by the chain of their own ideas. There are 10 chains. Mm-hmm. There are 10 links in your chain. Which one is the tightest or the hardest one for people to break free from?
I would probably say they're all hard. I would probably say the first one. So the first link in the chain of ideas, which is zero sum, the zero sum story, which effectively states that if your group is gaining, my group is losing. And I write about how going all the way back to 2011, there was a study that came out that year that found that white Americans who had witnessed the progress of Black people over the last few decades believed that progress had come at their expense. Mm. And they had started to believe as early as 2011 that white Americans were becoming the primary victims of racism. But you had other studies that, or even sort of journalistic reports that would ask white Americans, do you remember a specific time in which you were a subject of, let's say, a racist practice? And usually people could not speak to that. Mm. And I think what was happening here is zero sum was causing them to see Black accomplishments and assume that was coming at the expense of white people. And I think that happens across the board via religion, via ethnicity, via gender, that people believe that there's this scarcity of resources, They believe that we are fundamentally at war as groups, and that as those other groups gain, my group loses. And frankly, the studies show that that's actually not the case.
Yeah. So that's the first link. That link is somewhat inculcated within us right after birth. Are we ever going to break it?
I think there is a way for us to break it from the standpoint that what's ultimately inculcated in us socially as we grow older is what is the in-group and what is the out-group, right? And so we are led to believe that, for instance, there are fundamental racial differences, right? And we are misled into believing that there's a more profound difference between, let's say, someone who practices Catholicism and someone who practices Islam than somebody who practices Catholicism and somebody who practices Protestantism, right? We're led to believe that there are these profound differences between race, between religion, between, ethnicity, and as opposed to being taught a different idea, which is that as other groups gain, I gain. So to give an example, as it relates to religion, imagine if we were taught the idea that as more people of different religious faiths are given the freedom to practice their religion, that actually ensures that I can practice my religion, that other people gain religious freedom, I gain religious freedom. Because if we have a politician warring against Islam, then ultimately another politician can end up warring against my religion. Yeah. What if we thought in that sort of positive sort of sum theory as opposed to zero sum?
I know you're not a child psychologist, but I think about my own kids, and that's something that we have to really share with them early on, right? That's the idea.
Yeah, and it's possible.
Yeah. So you introduce 2 tools in this book, and I want our listeners to walk away knowing them, really, to make sure that they understand it. The first one was orchestrated distancing. Did you come up with that? That was yours, right? That's original. Can you walk through that first? And then the other one is proximity denial.
Yeah, so with orchestrated distancing, what I was trying to understand in researching this book, and it first and foremost started with someone like Marine Le Pen. So Marine Le Pen, for those who aren't familiar with Marine, she is the most sort of influential and prominent great replacement politician in France. And when I say great replacement politician, I'm talking about a politician who primarily uses great replacement theory, as sort of part of their political sort of messaging. Her father was the founder or co-founder of an organization called the National Front. The National Front had long been seen as this deeply racist, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, neo-Nazi party in France. And so how would Marine Le Pen be able to ascend to become, according to the polls, at least before her recent conviction, the most popular politician in France? Well, part of that is you have to present yourself as electable. And for a long time, if you were obviously rendered a neo-Nazi or racist or anti-Semitic or Islamophobic, it would, well, maybe not the last one, it would be hard for you to become such a popular politician. And how could you ascend to become the most popular politician of a party that was co-founded by people who collaborated with Nazis? So how you do that? You basically orchestrate distance, right? You basically present yourself as certainly not even connected ideologically to your own father, let alone to the ideas that have long persisted in your party. And so whenever someone in your party says something that is racist, you distance yourself from it and say that's not representative, of me. Even your own party's history, you distance yourself from it. You renovate the ideas within your party, and give them sort of new names and new sort of targets, but it's the same idea. So that's what I show is orchestrated distancing. It certainly happened with Marine Le Pen, who it's happened, for instance, in a few days. The president of Chile, who's also espoused great replacement theory, Jose Antonio Cast, his father was a Nazi lieutenant, but he's orchestrated distance.
Can you repeat that just for the audience? That blows my mind,
yeah.
Honestly. Can you just...
Yeah, the next president of Chile, Jose Antonio Cast, his father was a Nazi lieutenant. And not only that, his father was a major supporter of Augusto Pinochet, one of the most murderous dictators in Latin American history. And Cast himself has praised Pinochet. And so how do you do that? Through orchestrating distance.
So the virus really does just mutate.
It does. And I wanted to show, frankly, in the book that I think many people, of course, understand and have some semblance of recognition of those fascist leaders during the World War II era. And there's a common recognition of how deeply harmful and racist those leaders were to their nations and to, frankly, international relations. But you know what we forget about? Those people had children. They had grandchildren.
Yeah.
Right? And what I try to show in Chain of Ideas is in certain cases, their children or grandchildren are literally now have renovated their ideas in positions of immense power.
I don't remember the exact quote, but Le Pen, did she not tell her colleagues, hey, look, just play along. We need this to, these are my words, but play along. We need this to get the vote and then we can make the change. Was she on record saying that?
What happened is there was an investigative reporter who went undercover and spoke undercover to one of the leaders of Le Pen's party. And in that conversation, this leader essentially states that, you know, we cannot reveal who we really are, meaning we can't reveal that we are espousing great replacement theory, that, you know, which of course connects to some of the most dangerous ideas of the modern world, because we need to get into power. And then once we get into power, we're going to do what we want.
Couldn't one argue that in the U.S. specifically, just looking through the U.S. lens, that nobody wants a distance from the hate? They want to embrace the hate, anti-Palestinian racism, Islamophobia, whatever it may be, that makes them look good in the eyes of their constituents?
What's, I think, unique about the U.S. context is that there are certain forms of hate that people are embracing and certain forms of hate that they're distancing from. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what makes it even a little bit more complicated, you know, in the U.S. So they're embracing, as you mentioned, you know, Islamophobia, particularly towards Palestinians. They're embracing xenophobia, particularly against immigrants of color. But then they're simultaneously distancing from their own anti-Semitism. They're distancing from their anti-Black racism in certain types of ways. And so, yeah, that's what makes some of these leaders quite interesting.
Yeah. That's a whole other book, I'm
Yes.
guessing. Yeah. So you talk about proximity denial. Can you walk us through that as well and give us a real life example for the audience of what that looks like?
Sure. Well, first, let me just state that another reason I think why great replacement theory has become what I show in Chain of Ideas, the most dominant political theory of our time, is because it has largely been presented as a quote unquote not racist theory. But like when you make people believe that their racial or ethnic group is under attack and that you are here to defend them, you can present your actions and their ideas as virtuous, yeah. Right? And so one of the ways in which these political parties have ended up doing this has been the use of what I call in the book, these spokespersons of color, you know, particularly Black spokespersons, in certain cases, Muslim spokespersons, in certain cases, many cases, women, queer, Camus himself is a gay man who's one of the sort of pioneers of gay literature in France. And so what these specific leaders go about saying is, you know what, the Republican Party cannot be racist, because if it was racist, it wouldn't have me in it. Or they say that I, as Tim Scott has said multiple times, I know what racism is. And I know that racism no longer exists in the country as it did for my grandfather. What that person is saying is that because of their proximity to, let's say, blackness, I am a black man, right? It gives them the ability to deny the existence of racism. And this extends what we've commonly heard, which is you say a white person saying, I can't be racist because I have a black spouse, right? What are they doing? They're saying, I'm proximate to black people, so therefore I can't be racist. Well, they've taken it another step and said, I am a black person, right? So my ideas, this party, Great Replacement Theory, is not racist. And what's critical also about proximity denial is these figures argue that the subject of the bigotry is fundamentally an expert on that bigotry. So that's how they're able to say, I know what racism is, and it doesn't exist in the Republican Party.
And you also mentioned in the book that stats don't matter. They don't care about the data.
They don't.
They believe what they believe, and I don't remember the exact quote, but somebody said, and you quoted somebody in the book saying that if you believe the stats, then there's something wrong, or I don't remember the exact quote. Do you remember it?
Yeah, so the second link in the chain of ideas, which is absolutely pivotal to the emergence of Great Replacement Theory, is this idea that racial inequity data should just be ignored. Like, it just doesn't mean anything, it doesn't matter. And indeed, Camus once stated, and I'm paraphrasing him, that if statistics do not reveal that there is a such thing as the Great Replacement, then the Great Replacement isn't the problem, statistics are the problem. So we need to do away with statistics. And I cited a number of instances in which you had elected officials who were expressing support for thinkers who had basically stated that science should not matter. I give the example of the current prime minister of Italy, Meloni, who cites in a scholar who had previously stated that part of the problem of contemporary society is people are relying too much on science and not as much on religion to understand sort of truth in the world.
That's crazy.
Mm-hmm.
No, really, that is crazy. Unless the data supports whatever they want to support, I'm assuming, right?
Because part of it, the data doesn't support it, right?
Yeah.
When you look at the European Union, when you look at the United States, when you look at particular countries, the data does not support this idea that immigrants, particularly immigrants of color, are just overrunning, the nation. I believe I cite in the book that the European Union, 91%, if I'm remembering correctly, of people in the European Union were born in the European Union. That doesn't sound like it's being overrun, right, by these immigrants from Africa and the Middle East, right? Or you could have a case in which people are saying that Muslims are replacing Christians in Europe. But again, when you look at the data, there are a lot of people who are leaving Christianity, but they're not leaving Christianity for Islam. They're leaving Christianity and becoming unaffiliated. Yeah. But again, that doesn't support this notion that, quote, Islam is replacing Christianity and we need to engage in this holy war, with Israel to sort of reel in Islam and its sort of state sort of force in Iran.
But the data they do use is sort of recency bias. So there is some sort of incident, for example, with a Muslim. Look, see, that proves our point. That happened 2 days ago. And throughout all the other data, we're going to focus on that one piece right there.
And that is, ironically, the third link in the chain of ideas, which is this notion that racism, they define racism as biological prejudice and interpersonal discrimination. And the reason why they argue biological prejudice is because it allows them to say that a multicultural society is harmful, or it allows, like a congressperson yesterday, to say that pluralism is a lie. And then they're like, well, we're talking about cultures, right? So this isn't racist. Only things that are racist ideas if you say that a particular racial group is genetically inferior, but it's not racist to say that they're culturally inferior. Or the other side, which is interpersonal discrimination, it allows them to take interpersonal actions between, let's say, racial groups. Let's say if a white person is affected in a particular way by a black person or a brown person, see, that's the example that anti-white racism is on the rise. And the reason why they want to focus on interpersonal is because when you actually look at it structurally, there's no data that actually supports that. When you look at what's happening to white people as a group, there's no data that actually supports that anti-white racism is on the rise. So that's why they've redefined racism to make the case for great replacement theory.
What is anti-white racism anyway? I sincerely mean it. I mean, what is it?
Well, first of all, I think the way that they operationalize anti-white racism is fundamentally through zero sum. So if you have a such thing as, Black people who are congregating to study their history, you're not just coming together to study your history, you're fundamentally erasing the history of white people, they claim. Or if you ensure equal opportunity for everyone, so everyone could get into the room, in a room that previously white people were primarily the ones that were being included, in their mind, you're actually not trying to open up the room to everyone, you're trying to bar white people from the room. So that's how they end up imagining that anti-white racism is on the rise, which to me is another major link in the chain of ideas, the fifth link in the chain of ideas.
So this is a Palestinian podcast, obviously. So I got to talk about Palestine a little bit. I think I counted, don't quote me, you mentioned Palestine maybe 75 times over maybe 10 chapters or something to that effect. Again, don't quote me. Why was it important to focus on Palestine in those chapters in this specific book?
Well, let me just say, when I set out to write Chain of Ideas, as I mentioned earlier, I was expecting to primarily write an American story, right? I did not expect for this to be a global story. But once I decided that this history of the reemergence of great replacement theory was a global story, then I went out and decided to chronicle it wherever I found it and wherever it was meaningful. And so certainly I ended up finding great replacement theory as one of the justifications that particularly Netanyahu and others around him have used for the recent genocide. In Gaza, noticed connections between the way, and I narrate this in the final section, between the way Netanyahu and others justified the war in Gaza with the way in which Putin justified the war in Ukraine. I don't think many Americans are familiar with the fact that Putin framed Ukraine as a nation that didn't exist, as a culture that didn't exist, as a place that was fundamentally part of Russia. And he framed Ukrainian nationalists, or those who were fighting to maintain the freedom of Ukraine, as fundamentally terrorists and neo-Nazis. And so you see those similarities in the way Israeli officials have framed Palestinians who are fighting off settler colonialism or who are fighting, for freedom. So that's one thing. I think the other thing, and I think that this is incredibly important, is Camus when he wrote The Great Replacement, I should say published The Great Replacement in 2011, he positioned as the primary replacers as people, as Africans and Muslims. So those were the two groups, Black people and Muslims, who he positioned as the primary replacers of white people. As a result, I had to really show the expansiveness of that. And because, of course, you have different Muslim groups in different areas who are being positioned in similar and different ways as replacers.
Yeah. You introduced the concept called genocide theory, which you say is the most extreme version of great replacement theory. You say it paints a subjugated political group as wholly determined to bring about the genocide or extinction of a ruling group. You apply that to what's happening in Gaza, obviously, and you mention Netanyahu invoking Amalek and Gallant, saying we are fighting human animals, which is eerily similar to Himmler. I think he used it in 1943, if I'm not mistaken. Walk us through that a little bit.
Well, first, let me contextualize this in the U.S. context, because I think people are more familiar with those who have been arguing for years that white Americans are being subjected to a genocide. So there are all these ideas that have been circulating recently about a white genocide. I think most Americans may know that the young white male who ended up murdering people in that Buffalo supermarket, imagined that he was defending white people from a genocide. I think most Americans would know that Dylan Roof, who killed those churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina, imagined that African Americans were engaging in a genocide of white Americans, particularly through crime. I think most people should know that the shooter in Pittsburgh positioned Jews as engaging in a genocide of white Americans. And of course, in this case, these great replacement theorists racialized Jews as separate from white people. And then the same thing with the shooter in El Paso, right? Imagine that Latinos were engaging in a genocide of white people. So I think most Americans are familiar with the ways in which this genocide theory has justified or incited mass shootings in the United States. I think people are less aware of how these very idea can be used not just by a person with a rifle, but a person with an army. And that a person with an army can say that this particular group, Palestinians, are inherently human animals who are coming and trying to eradicate us. In the case of Netanyahu, he has used a biblical tale to claim that Palestinians are seeking to eradicate Israelis, and so we have to essentially protect ourselves. That's genocide theory. And indeed, I cite in the book previous Israeli thinkers who literally had basically described Palestinians in that way. And I think it's important for us to come to grips with that this is the most dangerous idea that there is. And so if you're positioning a subjugated, disadvantaged, disempowered, largely minoritized group who is fighting for their freedom or fighting for their land or power as not fighting for their freedom and rights, but seeking to engage in a genocide of white people in the United States or Muslims or Jews or whatever group is in the majority, you now have an incredibly powerful way to justify genocide and mass murder and war.
You know, you're going to get a lot of heat for this book, I think, on many levels. But I got to ask you, and I appreciate your courage, it would have been easier for you not to mention Palestine at all in the book. Why'd you do it?
Because I'm a scholar. I think as scholars, if we are not...
But you have other scholars who are skipping it. I guess that's my point.
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know whether they would truly be scholars then, right? Because to me, I think as a scholar, it is our job to follow the research, right? It's our job to write from the research. It's our job to present the research, and it is not our job to avoid presenting a particular story because we could get pushback from it. To me, that's not a scholar, that's a propagandist. And I think it's important for us to distinguish in our time between a scholar and a propagandist. I think it's important for us to even distinguish between a journalist and a propagandist, because similarly, as a journalist, I think it's important to follow the reporting. Wherever the reporting takes you is where you're supposed to go, is the standpoint you're supposed to write from. And I think that I can't personally write a book about propagandists, right? Because those who are spreading great replacement theory are propagandists, and then turn around and be a propagandist myself.
That's a perfect segue to Tucker Carlson. Can you please tell the pro-Palestinian movement that Tucker Carlson is not our friend? He promoted great replacement theory over 400 times on his show, almost 50 hours of it. The neo-Nazi website Daily Stormer called him literally our greatest ally. Has he rebranded himself all of a sudden? I'm just not understanding.
I do think it is important for people to recognize, if somebody was to ask me, what non-politician in the U.S. context is more responsible for the reemergence of great replacement theory than anyone else? A great replacement theory that has positioned Black and brown people, Muslims, immigrants of color as replacers, as invaders, as coming to harm Christians and white people. I would say Tucker Carlson is at the top of that list. And not just because he promoted great replacement theory hundreds of times on his shows in a number of different ways, from arguing that the Democratic Party was literally importing voters of color to steal elections, or arguing hundreds of times that anti-white racism was this scourge that was destroying the nation. Or even I remember one segment in which I write about in Chain of Ideas, in which he evokes the genocide in Rwanda and connects that to what he imagined that white people would be or could be facing. What he's also done is he has literally interviewed on his show, or subsequently after he left Fox News, some of the most powerful great replacement theorists around the world. And so, section 2 in Chain of Ideas revolves around a conversation between Tucker Carlson and Viktor Orban in Budapest that I think allows people to then see the global influence, of his racist propaganda.
And he's one of the ones that went after you quite aggressively, correct?
Of course.
Yeah. So what is this? Is this a rebranding of Tucker Carlson? Is he evolving in his way that he's going to spread hate or deliver the message of great replacement theory?
From what I remember, even in some of those actual shows where he challenges U.S. or even Israeli foreign policy, he actually has turned around and espoused great replacement theory, right? And so he certainly has not moved away from great replacement theory. What I suspect is happening is, we talked about this earlier, that he may be recognizing the criticality of himself engaging in a form of orchestrated distancing or orchestrated connecting, right? I'm going to become connected to particular political movements in order to then increase my standing so I have a better ability to manipulate people.
That's fascinating. You also named 4 actors that are driving the great replacement theory: financiers, theorists, politicians, and soldiers who kill for it, in Oslo, Christchurch, El Paso, and Buffalo as examples. Can you give us an example of each, if you could, a category? I'm sure Tucker's in there somewhere, obviously.
Sure. So we can start with, Tucker in terms of as a great replacement theorist. And so this is a person who typically has a pretty immense platform and is using their platform to spread great replacement theory in their nation and frankly, around the world. I think in terms of a financier. So these are people who are financing those media platforms or owning them, where great replacement theory is spreading, and or they're financing the political parties that are spreading great replacement theory. And probably the most obvious example in the US context is Elon Musk, who of course not only owns Twitter or X now, but has funded the Trump reelection campaign to the tune of $250 million. And he's elevated great replacement parties around Europe and even connected with great replacement politicians in Latin America, like Bukele and the president of Argentina. In terms of great replacement soldiers, so I've mentioned some of those soldiers who ended up mass murdering people in the United States. But I don't think people in the United States understand that there's been similar mass shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, in which dozens of Muslims were murdered by somebody who then, before the action, wrote a manifesto called The Great Replacement, or even someone in Munich, in Oslo, in parts of Italy. I mean, it's been happening all over the world in the last 2 decades. And then finally, the great replacement politicians. And these are elected officials who use great replacement theory in order to get elected or to stay elected, which is to say, I'm going to present to the American people that your nation is being invaded by immigrants from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, and they're coming and taking your jobs. They're coming and killing you, and I'm going to stand up and protect you. And so typically these great replacement politicians are authoritarians. They use great replacement theory to enrage people, to get them to believe that their lives are under attack and that they need to almost give up their rights in order to maintain their safety.
What comes first, though, out of that list? The financier, the theorist, the politician? I'm assuming the soldiers are always last. But what comes first?
I actually haven't been able to discover that. I think it's circular. What I'm finding is that certainly you have the great replacement financiers who are recognizing that there are many lower and middle income people whose wages are stagnating, whose livelihoods are declining, and those livelihoods are declining because of their hyper-exploitation, meaning the hyper-exploitation of those financiers. So it makes sense for them to support the spread of a great replacement theory that causes those white working class people to believe that they can't get a job because that black migrant from Haiti stole it, right? It makes certainly sense. And similarly, if you're an elected official and you are instituting policies that are allowing that financier to continue to hyper-exploit people, you don't want them blaming you for why they're struggling. There's a political self-interest in you certainly, pushing that.
Yeah, this is just my research and training around organization development, where we focus on finding the root cause, trying to figure out what the root cause is. Is it the politicians or the theorists, right?
Well, let me say, what I've actually found in my work just more broadly on the history of racism, there's largely been 3 major actors who have created and reinforced the structure of racism. And that is the economic actor, the political actor, and the cultural actor. And what I found from my work is it isn't necessarily fully accurate to state that it's all rooted in economics, because you literally have politicians who are truly doing this out of political self-interest. And then you have cultural actors like a Renaud Camus, who was a novelist, right, who is likely aggrieved by the fact that you have these Black and brown novelists of color who are taking up literary space in France because their novels are interesting and are helpful. So instead of being like, you know what, you know, we're having these different types of novelists with different stories that I can learn better about other people. Instead, you can have someone like him who doesn't want to compete, right? Yeah. Or who doesn't want to add to that literature, and instead is going to push a theory that then undermines those novels, so that now he will have pretty much free reign, right, in those literary spaces. So there's a cultural self-interest there, and obviously we understand the economic self-interest. So I think for the individual actors, their self-interest based on their positionality is typically different.
I want to go over the part that towards, I think it was the end of the book. I even went to my wife and I was like, oh my God, the way you describe this just hit me like a ton of bricks. You talk about the renovated house of Hitler. You write that after 1945, the house of Hitler became uninhabitable, but politicians did not abandon the house. They gutted it. They renovated it. New walls and fixtures and furniture. White and Christian, the new Aryan. Muslim and immigrant, the new Jew. Remigration, the new final solution. How is it possible after all of these years that the house of Hitler is still standing?
The same reason that you have people living in houses that were built in 1933, but they've been fully renovated, right? Yeah. So they have completely, it seems like a brand new house, and it is primarily tailored to their tastes in this moment. So even if it's a old house, right? Mm-hmm. It was built nearly a century ago. It has been completely renovated to their political tastes, and that buyer is not going to see anything that looks like it was built in 1933, right? That's how, and so that's why to me that an analogy works, because that's precisely what's happened with Great Replacement theory. We have to recognize that one of the defining characteristics of Nazism was this idea that Jews in Germany and Europe more broadly were alien to the nation and to the continent, and that they were engaging in the replacing of quote, Aryans, and that there was this international conspiracy of elites that was facilitating that replacement. The same idea is being put forth today, that there is this international conspiracy, they typically call them globalists, that are enabling Muslims replacing Christians or Black people replacing white people. And because and I try to argue this, I try to show this in Chain of Ideas, because we have misdefined neo-Nazi. We're not able to recognize this. And when I say misdefined, we as scholars, as the general public, we've largely defined neo-Nazi as a Nazi idea that is still circulating. So if somebody is denying the Holocaust, if someone is hailing Hitler, then that person is espousing a neo-Nazi idea. But I would argue, what's new about that? Right? Even during the war, Hitler was denying the Holocaust. Like, that's a Nazi idea that has lived on to this day. But it is new to describe the alien as the Muslim. It is new to describe African Americans as fundamentally aliens. That's a new idea. So to me, that's what's actually neo-Nazi. And then finally, let me just state that we often do not provide an intellectual history of Nazism. So we act like nothing came before Nazism. We act like these Nazi theorists weren't inspired by anyone. And so that's why I also try to document in Chain of Ideas how these Nazi theorists were in many cases inspired by American theorists, particularly American eugenicists, you know, like someone like a Madison Grant, who wrote a book in 1916 called The Passing of the Great Race, which Hitler ultimately called my Bible.
You're not giving me much hope here for society. I'm going to be honest. Not despair, but it just seems like we continue to fall into the same traps. We can't get out of our own head. We're not doing the homework. We're not researching. What are we going to do here?
Well, actually, I was much more hopeless before researching and writing this book. And I think the reason why I was much more hopeless is because I did not fully understand what was happening. I didn't feel like it was enough to describe, let's say, this administration as espousing a racist idea. So I thought that that wasn't specific enough to describe this new iteration, this new ideology. I didn't fully understand how this regime was connected ideologically to Putin or to Orban or to Meloni in Italy or Bukele or Bolsonaro in Brazil. I didn't fully understand how they were learning from each other, how they were collectively writing a playbook for global and national domination. But once I realized that, and once I could name the ideology that was connecting them all, which was great replacement theory, then I could better understand what we were fighting against, at least ideologically. It's much harder for me, and I suspect for most people, to engage in a battle against something you can't even name, right? And so the naming of it and seeing its distinctions in different countries, I think gave me a better sense of how to resist. And so I became much more hopeful, as a result.
So give me some of that hope. What should I be looking at here for more hope based on your research?
Well, let me give you an example. I'm hoping that one thing that people take away from Chain of Ideas is that these forces that we recognize are anti-democratic, are demonizing particular racial, ethnic, and religious groups, that these forces are in collaboration, that they're connecting, that they're learning from each other. So what does that say to me? We need to be learning from each other, right? We need to be building transnational anti-racist movements. We need to be learning what's working in different countries so we could apply that to our country. We need to develop forms of solidarity across racial and class and gender and religious and national lines in order to fight back against this scourge of great replacement theory, because those theorists and financiers and politicians have already built those connections, those linkages, as I document. And I do think that that is happening on some level, which to me gives me hope. But I also know that when I look at past global movements against racism, against colonialism, against Nazism, we were able to develop a sense of global solidarity when we can collectively name what we are fighting against and define it clearly and have a definition that was expansive enough that we could each recognize its specificity in our own national context.
I have hope. The last segment we offer here, if you don't mind, where we allow you to look at the camera and deliver a message to whomever you like to. It could be about the book. It could be a greater message for the community. Totally your call.
Well, let me just say I'm just honored that we could be in conversation, and I am honored to be able to present Chain of Ideas to the world, and my message, frankly, is to continue on what I was just describing. And I think it's important for us as human beings, if they're going to develop this chain of ideas that causes people to consent to their own domination through looking at other, quote unquote, other people as their fundamental political adversaries who are coming to replace and destroy them, we can develop a counter narrative. We can develop a narrative that says that there is a such thing as a chain of humanity, that we're all linked, despite our class and religious and racial and ethnic differences, that we are all fundamentally linked. And the strength of that chain can only be ensured by strengthening the weakest link. And typically for each one of our links, that weakest link is whatever group that we can't see ourselves in. So how can we find our humanity in everyone? How can we connect and build solidarity with everyone? And that's how I think we would be able to free ourselves from the chain of ideas.
Dr. Kendi, thank you so much. I hope to have you on for a third time.
Yes.
That's okay with you. It's been an absolute honor and privilege. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Listen, stay tuned, cause it's time for Sumud.